I think what's lost in this discussion of the Iran deal sometimes is the impact of the sanctions on the Iranian people. So I'm wondering if some of the panelists can speak to that, because I think that is lost, and sanctions are often viewed as an alternative to war and a clean way to do with foreign policy, but that is not the reality.
Yes, I would be happy to talk to that because I have been sort of shouting this for some time now. And I'm happy to see that. So our organization, NIAC, has started to work with other communities, communities of heritage. So for instance, if it's a Cuban organization, a Venezuelan organization, an organization run by Afghan Americans, basically all of these communities whose countries of heritage, and oftentimes, therefore, their families and their friends who live in those countries have been impacted by sanctions, and they themselves have been impacted by sanctions in the US. And of course, the way that someone like me as an Iranian American is impacted by sanctions pales. It's almost a joke that I'm saying it, right? So I'm not saying it as if to compare how we are impacted with the way that Iranians in Iran are impacted, but as an example, so we understand how pernicious sanctions actually are. I mean, there are Iranian Americans who get their bank accounts closed because they have Iranian names, right? We can't, if I'm trying to send money through, Venmo to a friend and I use the word, Persian food, Iranian food, that gets flagged, my account gets frozen immediately. So there's these secondary consequences of sanctions that actually do affect people, American citizens here. But when you look at the impact that they have, not only on Iran, I can't talk about sanctions and only focus on Iran, despite the fact that I know that's the country we're talking about right now, because there is so much parallel and overlap in other situations and in other countries. And to me right now, the most poignant example of the brutality of sanctions and US economic policies is Afghanistan. And the fact that more Afghans are likely to die after the war, after a 20-year war, because of those very policies than they did during a war. So when they say sanctions, sanctions are benign. Sanctions are an alternative to war. They are war. Economic siege is war. A blockade, when we support Saudi Arabia in a war against Yemen and basically support a blockade that is starving millions of Yemenis, I mean, the US has a direct or indirect role in the world's worst ongoing humanitarian crisis, which is Yemen, and the world's worst oncoming humanitarian crisis, which is Afghanistan. So it's mind-boggling to believe that anybody could possibly believe that sanctions do not have the same or even a worse impact than war. The reason they could be considered worse is precisely because people don't realize or understand the impact that they have. They silently kill people versus bombs who do it in a very loud way. And so it's not, I believe that if the American public was actually aware of these things, of course, this is not part of the discussion, right? It's not a mainstream discussion to be had. But if they were aware of these things, they would not support those policies for the same reason they don't support policies that, just murder and kill people across the world. What's terrible about it when you think about it, though, is that our policymakers do know. They're totally aware. They're very much aware because groups like us continuously, like Mass Peace Action as well, continuously tell them this is what's happening. There's article after article written that this is what's happening. Not only that, but they also know that the scholarship, the actual research on sanctions shows that they're ineffective, that when they are carried out multilaterally, actually, if there's actual international support, they're only effective about 1/3 of the time. This is according to proponents of sanctions, okay? These are economists in the US who want sanctions, give these numbers. And when they're unilateral, when they're just US sanctions, they're effective 1/5 of the time. This is not an effective policy. And if you look at, I always think two cases are the most interesting to show just how ineffective they are. One is the case of Cuba, a country that has been under embargo for over 6 decades. What policy could you possibly enact for 60 plus years that doesn't work and then still believe that this is the way to go? That in and of itself should show you that the policy is ineffective. And of course, there have been sanctions on Iran since 1979. So we're looking at 40 plus years in that situation. And what was effective in changing Iranian behavior or what we deemed, or I don't like phrasing it that way, but we'll say in actually getting Iran to agree to oversight of its nuclear program was an agreement that allowed space for, and this is something that I believe Giorgio pointed out earlier in this discussion, that it had to actually give something to the Iranian side. That punishment alone will not actually positively affect the behavior that we see. And in fact, you have to have some kind of benefit to those states. And they're not just going to submit to being under the US thumb. And so when you talk about the impact of sanctions, as you can tell by my reaction, I get quite upset because I have family in Iran. I have my entire extended family lives in Iran. And having watched them suffer through the last several years, having watched them, people who were middle class, who now can't afford, basic things, who can't find medicines, who can't, we used to, when travelers would come and they would ask us to send things, they would ask for, gifts. Now they ask for vitamins. Now they ask for Tylenol. Now they ask for things that previously they were able to find in abundance and able to afford. And that's the other aspect of it that people fail to realize, that even when you have the scarcity of resources, right? Even when the resources are there, when you have impacted people's ability to buy things, it doesn't even matter if it's there because they simply can't afford it anymore.